So, hello everybody. My presentation is entitled The Economic Crisis and Electoral Support for the Radical Right, Some New and Unexpected Findings. I have two research questions. First, has the radical right electorally benefited from the recession that has hit Western Europe between 2008 or 2009 and 2013? And second, has the radical right performed particularly well in areas that have been very hard hit by the crisis? A little recapitulation of the literature. First, there's the famous crisis breeds extremism hypothesis. This goes back to the rise of the Hitler Party in the Weimar Republic. And there are some causal mechanisms in favor of this hypothesis. First is the relative deprivation approach. And the relative deprivation approach says that during economic crisis, citizens might develop frustrations that might be directed against the culprit, and this culprit might be foreigners. And then we have talked about yesterday, there's the realignment hypothesis that says that basically a crisis makes people lose trust in the governing party, and they might look elsewhere and might support more radical parties. And then there's also some empirical support in the recent literature for this hypothesis. Then there's a second strain of studies that find the radical right does not benefit from economic crisis. For example, arguments that are put forward in favor of this hypothesis is the radical right has never had a comprehensive plan to combat unemployment. Then there's the economic division hypothesis that the coalition that votes for the radical right is actually not united or disagrees on taxes, welfare provisions, and the desirable size of the public sector, and rather they agree on cultural issues. And finally, and this is relatively new, it goes back to Bloom, there's the shared pain hypothesis that states that everybody suffers from a crisis, so that brings people together instead of pushing them further away. There's also some empirical evidence for the fact that economic hardship or economic crisis does not benefit the radical right. So the goal of this research is to revisit this extremism, this crisis breeds extremism hypothesis, and I used the crisis that unfolded starting in 2009 to test this hypothesis. And I also want to look whether the severity of the crisis has an additional impact. So the focus of my study, it's a longitudinal study, it has data from 1990 to 2013, and I use a region level focus. I use all regions, the NUTS2 regions in Europe. And why adopting this regional focus? Because the economic crisis has differed tremendously within countries, but even more so between regions. For example, in 2009 in Portugal, growth rates differed by more than 4 points, and in Greece 2012, during the election, growth rates differed by more than 10 points within the countries between regions. So I think we have more variation if you look at regions. I also think there's a substantive argument to be made that people are more affected by what happens in their close environment rather than their far environment. And finally, a regional study tremendously increases the degrees of freedom. This is a methodological argument. Instead of comparing 17 Western European countries, I can compare 168 regions. So the operationalization of my main variables, the radical right-wing vote as a dependent variable. I follow Moody to 1996 and operationalize such a party if its program comprises 3 features. Some kind of authoritarianism. It can also be a charismatic leader, populism, and issue ownership of national identity against foreign influences. And this definition has also been put up by Art or Ballant. For economic crisis, my independent variables, I use 5 different indicators. First, I use a dummy for the time 2009 to 2013. Then I use the region unemployment, the region annual growth rate, and finally I use 2 interactions to determine whether the severity of a crisis has an additional impact. I have regional control variables, the percentage of foreigners per region. This goes back of the famous ethnic competition hypothesis. That means if there are more foreigners, there might be more animosity against foreigners. I control for the percentage of individuals with a college degree, and the idea is if there are more highly educated people in a region, the radical right-wing vote should decrease, and I control for population density. And this goes back to modernization theory, and I assume that in more densely populated areas or in more cities, there should be a lower support for the radical right because they're more cosmopolitan and they expose more post-materialist values. The design of the study, I use a panel analysis covering 168 regions from 17 Western European countries. I use all Western Europe. The only countries I don't include are tiny nations like Andorra, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and Monaco. Everything else is included. The average number of elections included per country is slightly over 6. The average regional radical right-wing vote share is slightly over 8 points. And in the multivariate analysis, I also include country dummies, with Austria serving as the reference category to control for national tides. Methodology, I use first some descriptive statistic to see how the vote has developed during the crisis, or the vote of the radical right has developed during the crisis. Then I use 2 panel analysis. The first panel analysis, I used 3 crisis variables, the crisis dummy, the unemployment and the growth rate, and the controls. In the second model, I include the interaction terms as well. The 2 models suffer from autocorrelation heteroscedasticity. That's why I use an autoregressive 1 model and Huber-White standard errors. I also rerun the models as a Tobit model because we have a lot of regions where they have 0 radical right-wing vote share, and as a control I run this Tobit model, but as I can already say, the results are the same. Here are some descriptive statistics to give you an idea how the radical right-wing vote developed in these 17 countries, and we can see it increased from the 90s to the most recent electoral cycle. But what's also interesting is that before the crisis, there was a bigger increase from, in the period from 2004 to 2008, there was a bigger increase than during the crisis. So this already gives us an indication that in general, there was not a big boost by the radical right based on the crisis. Now my 2 models. In the first model, we have the crisis dummy. It shows that the vote increased by slightly more than 1 point. The unemployment is statistically significant, but substantively very low. It basically says that if we have a 10-point gap in the unemployment rate between regions, there's a 1-point gap in the radical right-wing vote. Economic growth plays no impact. If we look at the interactive model, model 2, we get some very interesting findings. And the interesting findings are that regions that are severely affected, in general, actually have a lower vote share than regions that are not that severely affected. We see this, the 2 interaction terms, interaction term between the crisis and unemployment has a negative effect, and it's highly statistically significant. And the interactive between the crisis and the growth rate has a positive effect. It means those countries that have actually higher growth, or those regions that have higher growth, have higher support for the radical right. And both models fit decently well, and I have in both models a little more than 1,000 cases. So I think these are some unexpected findings, but to highlight them, I give you some more examples. For example, 4 of the 5 hardest hit countries, Greece, Ireland, Spain, and Portugal, and Iceland, they have not seen the emergence of the radical right during the crisis. Other countries that have suffered strongly, like Italy, have seen actually a decrease of the radical right-wing vote by more than 50%. In contrast, countries that have been, and also regions, I will come back to that, but countries that have been relatively spared from the crisis, such as Netherlands and Finland, have seen a tremendous increase in the radical right-wing vote. For the Netherlands, it's close to 10 points, and for Finland, it's 15 points from the election prior to the crisis election. And many regional examples confirm this pattern. For example, in Switzerland, the 2 regions with the highest unemployment rate and the second and third lowest growth rate have the lowest share of support for the Swiss, not Swiss Freedom, for the Swiss People's Party. There's a typo. But there are 2 exceptions to the rules, and these 2 exceptions are Greece and France. And in Greece, we see an upswing of the radical right-wing vote. They are about 22% if we include the combined vote share of Golden Dawn and a popular Orthodox rally. And France, they have seen a doubling of the vote. And between the pre-crisis elections and the crisis elections. And in these two regions, we also find that especially hard hit, in these countries, regions that especially hard hit have higher vote share for the radical right. So, and if we include these two countries from the analysis, the pattern I've shown you is even much stronger than with these countries. So these countries are kind of the exceptions to the rule, Greece and France. And so for theory, it appears that in general, it is more than the fear from the economic crisis that fosters radical right-wing support. And it seems that crisis rhetoric, that for example parties like the Truth employ, can prove successful in attracting voters in, among others, the Nordic countries or the Netherlands, in a setting where citizens are maybe afraid that the same crisis that has hit other European countries might also hit their own countries. However, as I said, there are two exceptions to this pattern, and these exceptions are Greece and France, and they do not follow the pattern. So for future research, I suggest that we should look more into the mechanism and determine why we have this different pattern in Greece and France in contrast to the rest. But in conclusion, I still find that the crisis actually didn't have a strong impact, and when it had an impact, it had a stronger impact in regions and countries that were actually relatively spared from the crisis. Thank you.